The story of Greece during the Nazi occupation is one of unthinkable suffering for its people. It was a time of terrible human sacrifice, heroic resistance, and collaboration. At the heart of the story was one man, Yannis Rallis, who led a puppet government installed by Adolf Hitler to do the Nazis' bidding. Rallis claimed he worked with the Nazis for one all-important reason: to prevent Greece from falling into the hands of communists. He even set up a brutal terror group known as the Security Battalions to hunt the communists down. But instead of saving Greece, he stood by as tens of thousands of Jews were deported to death camps. Whole villages were wiped out, and a devastating famine destroyed 1/10 of the country's population. So what is the truth about Yannis Rallis? Was he a patriot who was trying to defend his people from what he thought was a greater evil? Was he a well-intentioned man who just got it wrong? Or was he a malicious collaborator?
He made a very strange kind of decision to collaborate with the German forces. He was an anti-communist to the point of collaboration.
At 61, Yannis Rallis was already in his twilight years at the outbreak of war. The son of a former Greek prime minister, he came from a family with a long tradition in political leadership. A moderate and a patriot, he had served in several governments until 1935.
Rallis was a member of a patrician kind of family of politicians in Athens. He was a conservative, a royalist. He wasn't a fascist. He wasn't prominent in any way, good or bad.
Then in 1936, there came an event that threw Greece into turmoil. The country fell into a state of chaos following a general election. The Communist Party was on the rise, threatening the stability of the king, George II, and the government. So the king ignored the election and turned to a man who he thought could beat down the communists, Yannis Rallis. A former minister of war, Rallis modeled himself on Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy.
Arriverà al benessere, alla potenza e alla gloria.
Mussolini's fascist party and its armed militia, the Black Shirts, had already clashed with the communists in Italy and had successfully defeated them. Inspired by this, Rallis now introduced the fascist salute and a Mussolini-style national youth movement. He made it quite clear that his would be a staunchly anti-communist dictatorship. He swiftly declared a state of emergency and closed down the Greek parliament and pronounced himself dictator. Rallis, who had once been a political ally of Rallis, opposed this lurch towards fascism. At this stage, there was no inkling that this was a man who would ever collaborate with the Nazis. But before he could do anything about Rallis, events occurred that would change everything. In September 1939, World War II began. The German war machine blasted its way into Poland. For the people of Greece, miles from the conflict, this must have seemed another world away. But they hadn't reckoned on the man Metaxas had so admired, Benito Mussolini. Although seen as a figure of fun today, he didn't seem that way back in 1939. He had one of the largest armies and navies in Europe. And he also had a plan to recreate the old Roman Empire, an empire that included Greece.
Ha valicato le onde dei secoli e la serie delle generazioni. Vai agli inermi!
On October the 28th, 1940, Mussolini made his move. Italian troops invaded Greece, attacking the north of the country from Albania. Metaxas was horrified at his hero's betrayal. He rejected an ultimatum that the Italians be allowed in to take over the country. But as the invasion got underway, Mussolini had not counted on the Greek army. Lacking tanks, the Greek army decided to hit the invading Italians on the run, in the mountains. It gave them a distinct advantage. In just 6 weeks, the Greeks scored a decisive victory as they pushed the Italians back into Albania.
Cold steel and the sheer determination to win. These were the deciding factors. And here the hardy Greek mountain troops with their formidable bayonets came into their own. Well done, Greece.
The victory for the Greek military is regarded to this day by many as the first Allied victory of the Second World War. It was the first signs of a resistance that would become legendary.
Poor Mussolini has got just a teeny suspicion he's made a mistake, saying the Mediterranean was an Italian lake. What a surprise for the Duce, he can't put it over the Greeks.
To this day, the Greek rejection of the Italians' demands is still celebrated as a national holiday every year. Then in November 1940, the Royal Navy arrived in Greece bringing hundreds of British troops to support the Greek army. A declaration by the British government made a year earlier stated that in the event of a threat to Greek independence,
His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Greek government all the support in their power.
At first the British could only send a small force. Metaxas was keen to try and preserve his neutrality and not provoke Hitler. The British then added a number of Royal Air Force squadrons to the troops already in Greece. Their task was to help protect Greek cities, airfields and harbours from Italian air raids. Then, at the end of January 1941, Metaxas died. Churchill was now able to send a much bigger force to Greece. It consisted of 60,000 British, Australian, and New Zealand troops. At this stage, Adolf Hitler had advanced plans to invade Russia. But having just seen his ally Mussolini humiliated, he decided to act.
Why did the Germans decide to invade Greece in spite of their plan to invade Russia or the Soviet Union at the time? Mainly because they were afraid of British aircraft stationed in Greece, that the Brits might and would most definitely bomb the oil fields of Romania, where the German forces had planned to refuel during their attack on the eastern part of the Soviet Union. I think that was the major reason.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
On April the 6th, 1941, German forces launched a blitzkrieg on Greece. The Greek and British Commonwealth forces facing the Germans were overwhelmed and forced to retreat. Battered by constant air attacks and with the Germans hard on their heels, the Allied troops retreated to Greek ports to await evacuation. Before leaving, they destroyed as much of their equipment as they could. The majority managed to avoid capture, thanks to the Royal Navy. For those of mainland Greece, the war was over. On the 27th of April 1941, Hitler's troops marched into Athens. But still, the country did not surrender. Crete, a tactically important island in the Mediterranean, held out. Tens of thousands of Greek and Allied troops were stationed there. So Hitler ordered Operation Mercury, the largest airborne operation yet mounted. It began at dawn on May the 20th, 1941. 10,000 elite German paratroopers tumbled out of their low-flying transport planes over the north of the island. Their key objective was the airfield at Malomé, but they met stubborn resistance. Then, after 7 days of fighting, Crete finally fell. "10,000 Allied prisoners were taken, together with all their heavy weapons. The Germans too had suffered heavy losses, more than 3,000 paratroopers dead or missing. As a German general said, Crete had become the graveyard of the German paratroopers, and a disastrous victory.
It was a bloody mess. They lost most of their forces there, mainly because the Brits and the natives fought tooth and nail to keep the island. The native Cretans, who used all kinds of weapons, including pitchforks, waited for the Germans when they landed and they slaughtered them.
Greece was now completely in the hands of Hitler and his troops. Its government had fled, and the Allies had withdrawn. Greece was now occupied by three Axis forces: Italy, Germany, and Bulgaria. The Bulgarians took over the region of Thrace. The Germans occupied Salonika, Corinth, and the Aegean Islands and Crete, and the Italians took the rest, including the capital, Athens. For the Germans who now came flooding in, Greece was a kind of paradise. Many whiled away their time sightseeing. Swimming in the Aegean Sea became a popular pastime for the men and women of the German military. But the Germans also had a problem. They now had a country of 8 million people to run. With Germany fighting Britain in the west and about to invade Russia, they simply didn't have the manpower to rule Greece themselves. They needed a puppet government, manned by Greeks, who would do their bidding. Yannis Rallis now watched as the first of a series of collaborationist governments was set up. The official line to the Greek people was that it was better to work with the Nazis rather than to continue fighting. That way, ordinary people could best be protected. But it was a claim that soon rung very hollow indeed. The Axis powers imposed what they called reconstruction fees, meaning that the Greek people had to pay for the cost of being invaded. As the Greek coffers were very low, the Nazis took payment in the form of crops and goods. Food and materials that should have been feeding and clothing Greek men, women, and children.
I think the Germans looked at Greece as a country that should be looted, practically. They tried to extract as much as they could out of this country, and mainly they looted foodstuff, and therefore deprived the population from basic foodstuff.
The lack of food was made even worse by the Allies. They were blockading Greece to starve out the Axis forces. The result became known as the Great Famine. As winter closed in, Greeks living in the cities found they couldn't get food. People were reduced to scavenging in bomb sites for anything to eat.
The winter of 1942 was absolutely disastrous. People just dropped in the streets. I remember my parents were telling me that they went to church one day and the church had this strange odor. And they realized that bodies were being stacked into the church and in a decaying state of affairs. And this was commonplace. It happened every day, practically, that winter. Something in the vicinity of 400,000 or maybe 500,000 dead was incurred because of lack of food.
As their people starved, the collaborationist politicians did nothing. But others did. Resistance movements began springing up, mainly in the countryside and the mountains. These resistance groups reflected the fractured nature of Greek politics. Nationalist, liberal, socialist and communist fighters all began vying for power. The largest resistance group to emerge was the National Liberation Front, the EAM. It was made up largely of communists and had its own military wing, known as Hellas.
The only organized force in Greece, organized in clandestine, let's say, activities, was the Communist Party. They had been under Metaxas's constant harassment. Many were imprisoned, and when the Germans entered Greece, prisons were, even before the Germans entered Greece, prisons were opened and people were let free. Many of these people who were once interned and were being under surveillance became the leaders of the new resistance force.
The main rival to the communist Hellas group was the right-wing National Republican Greek League, known as EDIS. The two rival groups clashed often as their ideologies went head-to-head. But they did at least have one common cause. They loathed the occupying Germans, Italians, and Bulgarians, and they would stop at nothing to drive them out. One way to strike a blow against the Axis forces was to attack their supply lines. Greece was a crucial route for the Germans supporting their troops in North Africa. Sever those lines, and it would be a major step in bringing the German war machine to a halt. The British soon realized that if they could get the resistance movements on side, it could prove decisive. So they selected a team from the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. They were highly trained specialists who carried out secret and daring missions. Experts in espionage and surveillance. Their speciality was sabotage behind enemy lines. On the night of November the 25th, 1942, an SOE unit was parachuted into Greece. It met up with both communist-backed Hellas and nationalist Aegis fighters operating in the Greek mountains.
The British believed that the more damage the resistance forces did against the Germans, the better for the cause of the war. So they didn't really differentiate initially between left and right, who was communist or non-communist. They gave money to both sides, they tried to help both sides. In time, they realized that there was another war going on, and that was between the Communist Party and the other resistance forces.
Amazingly, the SOE team persuaded the two groups to work together. Their first mission was codenamed Operation Harling. Its target was the giant railway viaduct at Gorgopotamus. The bridge was part of a major supply line linking Thessalonica in the north and Athens in the south. Guerrillas from the two groups, along with members of the British Special Operations Team, attacked the viaduct and blew it up. The mission was a spectacular success. The vital viaduct was out of action for months. But it was the only time the two opposing guerrilla groups ever managed to cooperate. Italian and German troops were now sent out to put down the resistance. Their methods were vicious. For any Greek fighters who were caught, there could only be one outcome. Again, the collaborationist regime stood by and let it happen, as did Rallis. And the claim that they had only taken power in order to protect the Greek people would look even less convincing because of events elsewhere in the country. The city of Thessalonica had one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in Europe. There were 50,000 Sephardic Jews living in the city at the outbreak of World War II. For years, they had lived peacefully side by side with Greek Christians. But then the Germans arrived. Almost immediately, they began imposing anti-Jewish measures. Jewish newspapers were closed down. Jews were forced to wear a yellow Star of David. And Jewish families were forcibly removed from their homes. All the while, the collaborationist government did nothing to help them. In July 1942, all Jewish adult males in Thessalonica were ordered to report to the city's main square to register for compulsory labor. Deprived of any shade, they were made to perform exercises by their SS captors. Any Jews unable to do the exercises were insulted and beaten. And it would get far worse. In December 1942, the main Jewish cemetery in Thessalonica was destroyed. The following March, the city's entire Jewish community was crammed into railway boxcars, along with Jews from Thrace, the part of Greece occupied by Hitler's Bulgarian allies. A total of 60,000 men, women, and children were then sent in terrible conditions to Poland. There they died, in the gas chambers at Auschwitz and Treblinka. Almost the entire Jewish community of Thessalonica was wiped out. While the collaborationist ministers were guilty mainly of doing nothing, soon they and Rallis would become actively implicated in Nazi crimes. By April 1943, the resistance to the occupiers was growing. The Germans decided to turn to the one Greek they thought could help them deal with the guerrillas, Yannis Rallis. He now became Prime Minister.
They appoint collaboration governments. The third was under Ioannis Rallis, a politician of the royalist variety, the populist or People's Party variety, who understood very well that the war was more or less ending at the expense of Germany, but he feared the takeover by the communist-led resistance forces. So his major, I think, concern was to prepare Greece for the post-war state of affairs. But he was nevertheless in cahoots with the Germans.
Rallis was right about one thing. By the time he came to power, the German army was indeed in trouble. In Russia, its army was trapped in Stalingrad. In North Africa, its forces were now close to defeat. It couldn't fight on two major fronts and deal with Greek guerrillas. So it asked Rallis to form his own army. And he did. Rallis set up units known as security battalions.
The security battalions were mostly thugs that would brutalize people who were considered friends or left-leaning people, or friends of the Communist Party, or simply disinterested in giving information, or shirked from giving information against their fellow citizens. So they were not well liked by the population, obviously.
Armed and trained by the Nazis, the mission of the security battalions was to liquidate the resistance groups in the Greek countryside. On the face of it, this was a patriotic movement designed to combat communism. And the security battalions did prove popular. 22,000 men volunteered. But any idea that they were fighting for Greece was quickly dispelled. On joining up, each member had to swear an oath of loyalty not to Greece, but to Adolf Hitler. Rallis objected to the oath on the grounds that Greek military forces couldn't put themselves in the hands of a foreign government. But he was simply ignored. By the time Rallis became prime minister, the communist-dominated Hellas had already gained control of a third of the country. Rallis was now in the bizarre position of being a Greek patriot, providing Greek soldiers to attack Greek freedom fighters. And Rallis's position would soon become even more invidious, for the Nazis would make him complicit in their greatest crime of all, the Holocaust. In 1943, the Jewish community in the capital city of Athens suddenly came under threat, right on Rallis's doorstep.
The Allied invasion operations began from the beaches of the Axis Sicilian stronghold. Operations which are now nearing completion, which resulted in the downfall of Benito Mussolini, and which will go forward until Italy and then Germany lay down their arms with unconditional surrender.
Ironically, it was a series of Allied victories that led to the Germans turning on the Athenian Jews. In the summer of 1943, the Allies had landed in Sicily. They fought their way up through southern Italy, and by September, Mussolini's regime had collapsed. Italy, in effect, now changed sides and joined the Allies. Hitler had to act fast. Right across France, Yugoslavia and Greece, German troops disarmed their former Italian friends. They now seized control of territories that had previously been occupied by the Italians. By the end of October 1943, the Germans had regained control over the Aegean, including Athens. Now the city's Jews lay at their mercy.
The Germans take over all the territories under Italian occupation, including Athens, and that is where the Jews of Athens are threatened with extinction because their turn would come with the Germans. The Italians were less severe in persecuting the Jews as opposed to the Germans. Fortunately, the Athenian Jews were old Jews. They were from Roman times. They spoke the Greek language and they were not distinguishable.
But still the Nazis stepped up the pressure on the city's Jewish community, demanding that the Greek authorities help round them up. Many Greek police officers simply ignored instructions to arrest Jews and turn them over to the Germans. The Archbishop of Athens and Greece, Damaskinos Papandreou, also defied the Nazis. He instructed his priests to get their congregations to rescue Jews. He also sent a strongly worded letter of protest to Prime Minister Rallis and to the Germans. Rallis himself was no anti-Semite, but he was caught in a trap, eager to work with the Nazis to defeat communism. He tried to tread a fine line. In public, he supported the Nazis' anti-Jewish measures. In private, though, he didn't punish fellow Greeks for defying them. It gained him few friends. To escape persecution, many Athenian Jews headed for the mountains to join the partisans. Others left the city by boat. Many went into hiding. But by the end of the war, around 800 Athenian Jews had been rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. But it wasn't just the Jewish population which was a target for the German troops that had taken over the areas once occupied by the Italians. The Germans now gave orders to crush the Greek resistance.
All armed men are to be shot on the spot. Villages from where shots have been fired or where armed men have been encountered are to be destroyed, and the men of the village are to be shot.
The Germans took heavy reprisals. It was their policy to do so. They would kill, let's say, 20, 50 Greeks for one German soldier or officer, even more. So reprisals was in line for any attack against the Germans.
If the Germans couldn't find the perpetrators, then they would turn on ordinary villagers. They would be arrested and publicly executed. These reprisals set ordinary Greeks against the resistance.
How does one explain to the rest of society that we kill one German and then we have 50 or 20, whatever, Greeks shot for that? Hence, we had many occasions when the Germans practically eradicated villages in order to make them an example, to set an example for other resistance activities.
In December 1943, the bloodiest massacre on Greek soil during World War II took place. After Hellas forces had killed 81 German soldiers, a German unit was dispatched to the town of Kalavrita in the Peloponnese. When they reached the town, they locked all women and children in the local school. They then ordered all men and boys over 12 to a hill overlooking the village. There, the German troops machine-gunned them down. 696 men and boys were massacred. Only a handful survived to tell the tale. Then the German troops set about destroying the entire village, burning every building. Today in Kalavrita, there is a memorial to those who were slaughtered. It's called the Place of Sacrifice, and the events of that fateful day in December 1943 are still commemorated every year. But if they thought these atrocities would stop the resistance, the Germans were wrong. The guerrillas kept attacking them, and the Germans kept burning villages. By the end of the war, hundreds of Greek villages had been destroyed. These attacks were a disaster for Rallis. What little credibility he had as a protector of his people was lost. But again, instead of saying anything, he just stood by and did nothing. By now in Russia, the Germans were on the run. In the west, the Allies had landed at Normandy. An Allied invasion of Greece seemed only weeks away. The majority of Greeks were looking forward to the day of their liberation. For the Germans in Greece, it was time to get ready for a last-ditch defense of the fatherland. This meant protecting the roads and railways, which they would use to withdraw to Germany. For Rallis, This could have been a time for him to have distanced himself. He could have resigned as Prime Minister and saved something of his reputation. Instead, he chose to continue his collaboration. He still believed it was his duty to destroy the communists. And for him, the only route to achieve his aim was with the Germans. In August 1944, the Soviet army burst into the Balkans, swiftly overrunning Romania and forcing Bulgaria to sue for peace. The Bulgarian forces in northern Greece immediately disintegrated. The Germans were now in danger of being cut off from their homeland. They began to retreat north. Along the way, they left a trail of devastation.
Well, the first thing the Germans did while withdrawing was to demolish everything they could demolish. They blew up all railroad stations that they could do so. They destroyed power companies, everything. So Greece was in total shambles after that.
Key targets were strategic installations like the Corinth Canal. Months, if not years, would pass before they could be used again. One of the Germans' last acts in Athens was to remove the swastika flag that had flown from the Acropolis. At the same time, the premiership of Yannis Rallis finally came to a quiet and inglorious end. On October the 16th, 1944, British and Greek forces landed in Greek ports. Final proof that 4 years of Axis oppression and cruelty were finally over.
Carpets are spread in the street in front of the jeeps, and they are bombarded with flowers and fruit. Corinth, cleared of the enemy, receives with overwhelming enthusiasm the Greek and British troops.
The return of the British also brought the guerrilla groups into the Greek capital. Though they'd spent most of their time fighting the Germans in the mountains, they'd also been fighting each other, with the communist-backed Hellas jockeying for position to take control of the country after the war.
It's a rather complicated state of affairs because there were several wars being fought simultaneously. One was against the occupying forces by everybody, and then there was a war between the resistance movements for the future of Greece after the war. Who would take over the country after the war? Would it be a Republican regime? Would it be a royalist democracy? Or would it be a communist-led regime?
For 2 months, an uneasy calm existed between British forces on the Greek mainland and Hellas. But then early in December 1944, the one thing Rallis had been afraid of finally happened. Hellas forces rose up in Athens and attempted to seize control. It meant a new war, this time communists against the British. Churchill ordered British troops to crush the Hellas uprising.
Look at these pictures. British soldiers, comrades of the men who fought with Greeks against the Hun, are here engaged in fighting those same men. Airborne troops occupying a rooftop position fire their machine gun into a street of Athens to prevent the movement of Hellas forces.
Churchill went to Athens to oversee the creation of a pro-British government. The man he chose to lead it was Archbishop Damaskinos, who had done so much to protect Greek Jews from the Nazis. Now, a fierce battle began. The British unleashed a concentrated attack on the communist forces. RAF planes were even sent to attack their strongholds in the capital. After several weeks, the communist guerrillas were defeated. Archbishop Damaskinos and his government could at last establish itself. Order was restored, but it didn't last long.
A forward battalion moves up, and there goes the signal for the attack. Every type of modern weapon is brought into play as the bitter warfare surges back and forth over the desolate mountain passes.
In 1946, Greek communists once more took up arms. A fully fledged civil war broke out. It lasted 3 years and cost the lives of thousands of people. To end the civil war, the Greek government turned to the men who had served in Rallis's security battalions. They were released from prison to join Greek government forces fighting the communists. Eventually, in 1949, the civil war subsided. Greece remained free from communism. By then, Yannis Rallis was a forgotten relic of the past. He was tried as a Nazi collaborator in 1946 and sentenced to life in prison. Rallis's defense to his people was that he was right to fear communism. The uprisings after the war and the lives they cost certainly seem to be proof of that. But does fear of communism justify standing by when over 500,000 ordinary Greeks were starved to death? Does it justify supporting the Nazis' policy of transporting the Jews to the death camps? In terms of percentage of the population, Greece suffered amongst the worst of any country in World War II. Over 800,000 people, that's 10% of Greece's pre-war population, perished. And of course, in the end, communism, the thing Yannis Rallis most feared, was defeated not by the Nazis, but by the Western Allies.
His driving force was mainly anti-communist. He was an anti-communist to the point of collaboration. That was his main fault. He ought to have realized that during that period, being an anti-communist didn't mean what it might have meant 10 years later. It meant that he made a very silly kind of, or strange kind of decision to collaborate with the German forces. And the German forces were the ogre. It wasn't anyone else then, it was the Germans who starved 500,000 Greeks to death.
It's hardly surprising then that Yannis Rallis died in 1946, just 1 year after being imprisoned, a lonely and forgotten figure.